If you had to name one thing that you think gamers today take for granted in their favorite video games, what would it be? For me, that answer would be player expression. But what exactly does that mean? It's basically just a fancy way to say that the game gives you options. Enough options that two people can play the same game and produce wildly different results. Not like skill-based results, at least not always, but more like idea-based results. For a relatively extreme recent example, CRPGs like Baldur's Gate 3 are the ultimate expression of player expression. With so many classes to choose from, companions to adventure with, and choices to make that irreversibly change the state of the game's reality, you'd be hard-pressed to find two players who end up with identical games at the end of their adventures. This exists on a spectrum though, and the concept of player expression can be as simple as running with your preferred weapon in Counter-Strike, or even choosing your favorite charm loadout in Hollow Knight. Admittedly, that's not really something anyone bothers to talk about when it comes to the idea of player expression, because that's just kind of simple and boring. Important, sure, but nothing groundbreaking or super memorable on its own. Just about any video game ever has some level of player expression, but I believe there's a point of critical mass of accumulation around the design of this idea where player expression is front and center, and I think that's where most of the fun and more memorable systems live. It's clear that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to go down in history as one of gaming's all-time greats, and part of that is due to its execution of these ideas. With so many things to explore and so many ways to do it, it's easy to see where the player gets to express themselves through the game's stats and systems. But as much as I love Baldur's Gate and all the nerdy minutia that comes with a good CRPG, there's a different kind of player expression that I love even more. Super Mario 64 is getting close to 30 years old, and somehow it remains one of the best examples of movement-based player expression that exists in a 3D game. Glitches and speedrun tricks aside, there's no shortage of clever ways to tackle obstacles, and each 3D Mario game since then, culminating with Super Mario Odyssey at the beginning of the Switch's lifespan, has continued the tradition of giving Mario some of the most fun and most deceptively powerful movement abilities that exist in video games. These games boast movement systems with a skill ceiling that's so high that I doubt the speedrun of these games will ever be truly 100% solved. What these robust movement systems and the high mastery potential of them allow is an unparalleled level of player expression in motion alone. And more than that, these tools morph what would be a relatively simple trek to the end goal of a given section or level into an open-ended exploration and exploitation of said tools to reach your destination in your own way. You could take the more direct path laid out for you, or you can choose to try your luck and ability to get around in a less obvious but probably still completely intended way. This choice, and every minuscule press of the button to move your character around the field in pursuit of that goal, is how the player expresses themselves through play. Obviously, the Mario franchise is not the only one to focus its design in this way, but games with this level of player expression through motion are extremely rare. Games like Titanfall 2, Rocket League, and even Celeste come as easy examples of some games that do this kind of thing extremely well, but even more rare is the metroidvania that includes this level of depth. Super Metroid comes to mind as a classic that approaches some of the genre's highest highs in player expression, beaten out by the more modern Ori games, both of which have some really fun and expressive movement baked into the core of its abilities. But honestly, beyond those 2 or 3 games, I can't think of any more off the top of my head that even come close. Guacamelee climbs that ladder, but the abilities feel almost too static in how they move the player, so despite how great it can feel to nail a sequence in that game, it hits a plateau for expressiveness in my mind. Enter Pseudoregalia. Despite the crunchy PlayStation 1 era 3D graphics and the imagery of this thick with 2C's rabbit running around with no pants on, this unassuming little Metroidvania is an absolute masterclass in expressive movement. And when I say little, I mean it. This is a Game Jam game that was stretched out into a full release once the developer realized that they have something special here. But the full release is still only around 4 hours worth of game, but those 4 hours are extremely fun. Usually with these videos I do my best to avoid spoilers, but this game is so short and its movement upgrades are such a huge part of why I have to recommend it that I'm just gonna spoil everything. Don't fret though, because the only things that there are to spoil are what the movement upgrades are, the final boss fight, and maybe some of the areas, because as far as I can tell, there's absolutely no story in sight in Pseudoregalia. I mean, I can kind of maybe sorta see where there might have been a thing or two put in place to give the game a sort of narrative, but it's about as loose as it gets. You're dropped in the game with nothing. No abilities, no weapon, no direction, and no reason for being. You pop out of this mirror, and the only thing you hear when you interact with it is, "I hope I'm not too late." Too late for what? The only thing I can piece together is that maybe this world used to be chill, and somehow the princess got corrupted and now it's decidedly not chill. It's up to you to re-chillify it, I guess. Whatever, the story isn't really important here. What is important is finding your way out of this tutorial zone and getting to the game proper, because only after letting the game drip feed you your first few abilities and getting into the hub zone does the game begin to actually open up. At least, if you're able to. Before letting you out into the world, the game forces you into the first of 3 boss fights. You've got to beat this thing up to get the key and escape the tutorial. But for some reason, this creature has an absolutely absurd amount of health. And you don't. I don't know how many hits it took to take down or how long, but it was too much. And I think that this boss fight might be a reason that a lot of people might not get the chance to get to the rest of the game to have fun, because as great as Pseudoregalia's movement is going to be, its combat is never good. The combat is, at best, passable. It comes down to a few things. First off, the lack of precision afforded by the targeting system is extremely frustrating. There is a button on your controller that gives you a sort of Zelda-style lock-on, but it's extremely loose and finicky in a way that makes it feel like it's not actually really doing anything. Second, there's a lack of real feedback from the game, at least in this fight. Hollow Knight has similarly unflinching bosses, but one extremely clever thing that the game does to make you feel like you're actually accomplishing something in the fight, despite the enemy's lack of reactivity, is forcing the enemy to be stunned after hitting it so many times. I'm not saying that Pseudoregalia needs this exact mechanic, but for this early fight against this first boss, something needs to be done to both soften up the encounter and make the player feel like they're making progress. The game's final boss at least does have a recoil animation when you hit it, and you've played long enough by that point that you understand how the game's combat works, but this early in the game, this boss poses a huge problem. Third, and this doesn't really start to sink in until you've played the game for a few hours, but Pseudoregalia's movement really just doesn't feel like it's designed for combat. I do think there's a lot of tweaking that can be done to make the game's abilities work better in combat, but as it currently stands, it just feels like the combat is an afterthought. And let me be clear, I think it would be perfectly fine if the combat was just okay. After all, Ori and the Blind Forest has some pretty terrible combat too. But this game makes a huge mistake by putting such a tough fight so early in the game. It puts an expectation on you that simply isn't true, that you'll be fighting more big, crazy bosses as you push further into the game's world, but you just don't. It's this one, the final boss, and one sort of throwaway, super version of a normal enemy that dies in a slightly more reasonable amount of time than this one. Anyway, once you beat the first boss, you're thrust into the larger world of Pseudoregalia. There's a few distinct zones separated by loading screens, but don't let that fool you into thinking that each area is completely isolated and distinct. Most areas have at least 2 different ways to enter them from different parts of the world, as long as you have the correct abilities and know where to go. At this point in the game though, you're still lacking in any interesting movement options, and you're in a new area navigating a surreal landscape and fighting with bizarre enemies that attack you with sousaphones until you eventually find your way to your first upgrade. And this is where the game will really start to sell you on what it's capable of. And I imagine most people, will have found the wall kick ability first. You might initially think that this is just another simple wall jump. Big whoop, we've seen it in about 1,000,000 games prior, and this will be the 1,000,001st. But oh no, this ain't your granddaddy's wall jump. Ever since Nintendo decided that wall jumps in Metroid games should be easier and much less useful than they were in the older days of the franchise, wall jumps have been extremely easy to pull off in just about any game that they appear. And I get it, you get an upgrade in a metroidvania or some kind of action game, and you don't want your own personal lack of skill or mechanical ability to keep you from enjoying and exploring the world to its fullest potential. Super Metroid's wall jumps have a sort of rhythm and technique to them that isn't instantly intuitive. They're relatively difficult to pull off for a person that's new to the game, and even for someone like me who's played it as much as I have, they can still be pretty difficult to pull off precisely. But what makes it interesting is that, with a single exception, it's a 100% optional ability that is made and meant for advanced players to possibly break the game open with. Of course, Super Metroid was conceived of and created in a time when the general population's collective video game IQ was in the single digits. And now, comparatively, we're all super geniuses. I'm exaggerating a bit, but keep in mind that as gamers, it's easy for us to internalize and take for granted the language of video games. Go check out Rasputin's series, Gaming for a Non-Gamer, for a more in-depth look at this idea, but my point is this. I think that, as a video game playing collective, we're probably too good at video games now for something like Super Metroid's optional wall jump to work super well. Maybe it's not even us being good. Maybe it's just that the internet exists, and gaming culture has more or less normalized the infinite content machine that we live in. TLDR, if Super Metroid came out today, there'd be 1,000 videos on the first day telling you how to get a missile pack early and explaining the wall jump technique in excruciating detail. The one trick you should know before diving into Super Metroid. Like, come on, let people discover it on their own, man. There does still exist a subset of us humans that prefer to watch content about a game we're into after we're done with our initial experience of it, rather than waiting to absorb every little detail about it before or during our time playing. I'm not going to say either way is better than the other, but I personally prefer the older style of playing games. Grab something that looks interesting or fun, and then let it surprise me and drive me in the way that it wants to, not in the way that some YouTuber wants me to. It makes all the little discoveries, optional or not, feel that much more exciting. Anyway, that was a long tangent about wall jumps, but we're trying to talk about Pseudoregalia's wall jump, and dang, this thing is brilliant and expressive in a way that I haven't seen in a Metroidvania since Super Metroid's wall jump. And to be clear, this isn't exactly a wall jump, it's more of a wall kick. You kick, extending your leg out, and if it collides with a wall, you bounce. It's simple, it's responsive, and it's somewhat precise. You get 3 of these before you're forced to touch the ground again, and that's just enough to get into trouble. The reason I went on that massive tangent about Super Metroid's optional and relatively difficult wall jump tech is because this brings me back to that kind of mechanical design. This wall kick ability isn't the easiest ability in the world to use well. Getting the full potential out of it requires a decent amount of practice and learning about how it works. But what makes this brilliant is that you don't have to learn it to a degree of mastery to finish this game. But if you want to push both yours and the game's limits, the relatively high skill ceiling of this deceptively simple ability will give you a solid basis for making some really cool things happen. And guess what? That's just one ability. Pseudoregalia doesn't boast very many abilities, but each one is well thought out and rounds out a weakness in the character's movement that you may not have even realized was there. And even crazier, I think that they all come with some advanced techniques that you don't necessarily need to complete the game, but will help you tackle the obstacles in your own way. The wall kick, with some precision and practice, can get you up a single wall. It's not as powerful as Super Metroid's single wall jump, for example, especially since you can only do 3 of them, but it still works. It's easiest with 2 opposite walls, and even a corner will get you some decent height, but with some grit, sometimes you can make a single wall work even though it probably wanted you to have the next ability. And that next ability is the ground pound. More than just a ground pound, jumping immediately after landing will send you flying vertically in the air much higher than a normal jump. This is the intended way to help you get to higher platforms that the wall kick alone won't allow for. If you get spicy, you can take advantage of the other ability this unlocks, the ground pound cancel. It's simple to do, just press jump in the middle of a ground pound to backflip out of it. But this backflip, if positioned and executed correctly, will get you onto platforms that might be just out of reach otherwise. It's simple to do, but with all the buttons you'll be pressing, it can be kind of tricky to get the timing and execution right. Early on, the game gives you the slide ability, but it straight up tells you that the move is incomplete. That's because it's hoarding the best part of this ability for later, the slide jump. It's exactly what it sounds like. Jump out of a slide for a boost of speed that will take you further than a normal jump. This will be the backbone of your movement the moment you unlock it. Using this constantly and properly can be tricky and somewhat advanced in and of itself, but if you wanted to squeeze more speed out of this thick bunny, you can always do what comes naturally and bunny hop after a slide to maintain that momentum for as long as you're able to get frame-perfect jumps. On top of that, this game has the Super Mario 64 side flip technique, where if you jump out of a skidding animation, you can get a higher than normal jump, which can then be used to climb quickly or just for swag. But if you combine the side jump with the slide jump, you get an absolutely insanely high bounce that has been used to break the game significantly in speedruns. And guess what? That's just 3 of the abilities, and not even all of their tech. Granted, there aren't too many more, but I'm not going to sit here and write about and analyze every single one. I will say that the sauce you get out of the rest of the abilities isn't quite as savory as what you get out of these, but each one continues to pile on to the incredible feeling of moving around the world and solving its obstacle courses in a way that just feels amazing. And not to hate on it or anything, but Pseudoregalia manages to do all of this without resorting to the tried and true metroidvania trope of giving you a double jump. After all of that, you might have realized by now why exactly I went so hard on the game's combat in the first half of this video. This game isn't about combat. It's about sick movement and navigating obstacle courses in a sandboxy way that most game developers would be absolutely frightened of. It's not afraid to let you explore on your own terms, unlike most Metroidvania that demand that you explore on theirs. It's so sandboxy in its exploration elements that there isn't even a strict order to the abilities you collect. I got the wall kick first, but Iron Pineapple, according to his video, seems to have gotten the ground pound first. I believe you can also stumble upon the slide jump first if that's where you ended up. And does the game care? No, not even a little bit, and it's great. When it comes to Metroidvanias, I think one of the holy grails of world design is how the game handles or even encourages sequence breaks. But Pseudoregalia takes that idea and absolutely laughs in your face. It doesn't even know the meaning of the word sequence. Anything you think you might have done to break the progression? Nah, that's probably intended too. Just a little less obvious or a little bit more difficult. Either way, it's cool. The game wants you to explore and have fun in your own way, and that's part of its brilliance. Most players will finish anywhere between 3 and 5 hours. It's a very short game, but that short length ensures that the game doesn't overstay its welcome in the same way that so many games seem to want to drag on past the point of being fun. And for what it is, I think it's the perfect length. With no map, having the world be much larger would be much more confusing to navigate. I got lost dozens of times and found myself wishing for a map more often than not, but it truly doesn't need one with a world so small. Still, it'd be nice, but it's not strictly necessary. And with as poor as the game's combat is in general, I can't help but feel like the game would have left a much worse taste in my mouth had the combat been more of a main event than the sideshow distraction that it is now. Basically, the game doesn't need more bosses or enemies, it needs less. All that said, I want this developer to keep making games. They clearly have a good grasp on what makes 3D platforming fun, and they have an active itch.io page with some impressive prototypes, with videos that show off some pretty familiar moves and then some. This developer, called Ritzler, has the potential to make some incredibly memorable 3D platformers, and I'm on the edge of my seat looking forward to what they push out next. Like, maybe possibly potentially this 3D roguelite platformer that they have on their Steam page as coming soon, maybe? Or what about this other 3D platformer that they say that they put on hold while they work on other stuff and gain more experience and maybe look for a team? Anyway, go play Pseudoregalia. It's $6. It's incredible. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.